Nurse Lena Morales had one gloved hand on the bedrail when she looked at me and whispered, "His eyes don't match anymore." Just as the monitor began to race, the resident called it exhaustion. I had 10 seconds to decide whether to trust the clean scan from Dawn or the woman who had been awake for 16 hours. Hours earlier, room 814 had felt like the safest room in the ICU. I first met Frank Delaney a little after 4 in the morning, at that hollow hour, when the emergency department smells like antiseptic, burnt coffee, and the kind of fatigue that settles behind your eyes like wet sand. He was 61, a retired mail carrier with a split scalp, a mild tremor in his hands, and the old-fashioned habit of apologizing for taking up space, even while blood crept into the collar of his shirt. He kept saying he had only slipped in the garage, as if the body could always be negotiated with if you were polite enough. The first scan did not look catastrophic, which in my line of work is never the same thing as safe. It showed bruising, swelling we could watch, and enough uncertainty to earn him a bed in intensive care instead of a quick discharge, with paperwork and false comfort. His wife, Ruth, stood close enough to touch his shoulder, but not close enough to interrupt the rhythm of the room, while their daughter Claire asked careful questions in a voice that tried very hard not to sound afraid. I told them the truth, as gently as I could. The morning would tell us more than the night ever could. By the time he reached the ICU, the shift upstairs had already started to fray at the edges. Machines breathed for strangers, monitors answered one another in restless little bursts, and the overhead lights gave every face the same exhausted color. That was where Lena Morales took over, her scrub top creased from too many hours, her hair pinned back in a way that said she had stopped caring how she looked sometime before sunrise. She did not introduce herself with the rehearsed brightness some nurses wear like armor. She simply checked Frank's lines, straightened his blanket, and spoke to him as if being vulnerable had not made him smaller. I went up later to review his chart and found her standing at the bedside with one hand lightly resting near his wrist. Not touching him, just making a quiet promise to remain there. Frank was sleepy but responsive, and the repeat scan from early morning appeared stable enough to ease the room by a few degrees. Dr. Colin Reeves, the resident covering neurology, wore the expression of a man already moving on to his next problem, which is common in hospitals and dangerous in equal measure. He saw a monitored patient with numbers that behaved. Lena saw a man whose face no longer matched the version of him she had been tracking all day. What struck me was not urgency at first, but attention. Lena noticed that Frank stopped finishing his jokes, that his right hand seemed slower returning to the blanket, that his left eyelid carried an odd heaviness no machine could translate into a clean number. None of it was dramatic enough to stop a hallway conversation, and none of it belonged in the category young doctors like to call significant. Yet medicine has a cruel habit of hiding disaster inside details too small for arrogance to respect. Late in the afternoon, the ICU settled into that deceptive calm that comes just before something breaks. The sun had turned thin and colorless against the window. The coffee on the counter had gone cold, and even the alarm sounded tired. Frank drifted in and out. Ruth had finally gone to eat something, and Claire was answering family texts in the hallway when Lena leaned closer to his face and went still. I saw it a second later from the doorway. One pupil had opened wider than the other, like a warning sign trying very hard to whisper. I knew something had changed the moment Lena called my name, because she did not sound frightened in the ordinary way people do when machines get loud. She sounded focused, which is always worse. Frank's breathing had grown shallow and uneven. The pulse line on the monitor was climbing, and his face had taken on that terrible inward look I have seen too many times, as if some hidden door inside the body had swung open and all the light was leaving through it. Lena pointed without drama and said, "His left pupil is bigger, and it was not like that 20 minutes ago, Doctor." Reeves stepped to the bed, shined his penlight, and exhaled through his nose the way tired men do when they think they are being forced to entertain someone else's anxiety. He said the room lighting was uneven, that Frank had been medicated, that a double shift can make anyone see patterns that are not there. Lena did not raise her voice, and that was the part one respected most. She simply repeated herself with more certainty than before and said that when you spend 16 hours watching one face, you know when that face is no longer safe. Frank tried to answer me when I asked his name, but his words dragged together and dissolved before they became language. His right hand twitched once against the sheet, then lay still, and a thin line of saliva darkened the corner of his mouth, as if even swallowing had become too much to coordinate. The monitor began giving us faster, sharper beeps, each one sounding less like information and more like accusation. In the hallway, Claire half stood from her chair the moment she heard the tone change. Because families always learn the language of danger faster than we think. When Ruth came back with a paper cup of soup she had not touched, she saw the cluster of bodies around Frank's bed and stopped so suddenly the lid popped loose. Broth spilled over her fingers, but she never looked down. She looked only at me, because relatives search for the oldest face in the room when they need the truth, and age in a hospital often gets mistaken for certainty. I told her we were reassessing him, which was technically honest and emotionally useless. And I hated myself a little for how often those two things overlap. What made the room unbearable was not the noise, but the split between what was visible and what authority was willing to admit. Lena saw change with the naked eye. Reeves saw an inconvenient challenge to the story already written in the chart. Between them stood the kind of silence that kills people in respectable institutions. Because everyone wants to avoid overreacting until the overreaction becomes a eulogy spoken too late. I had lived long enough inside hospitals to know that the most dangerous word in medicine is not panic. It is probable. Then Frank vomited without warning. A thick choking surge that bent his body sideways and sent Claire gasping from the doorway. We rolled him, cleared his mouth, pushed a gyre, and watched his blood pressure climb like a ladder towards something ugly. Lena never stopped tracking his eyes. Reeves reached again for explanations that would have been comforting if comfort had still belonged in that room. I looked at Frank, then at Lena, and understood that the next decision would not be about scans or protocol at all. It would be about whether I trusted hierarchy more than the human being standing closest to the danger. The difficulty was not simply whether to order another scan. It was what that choice would cost in a hospital already running on stretched patience and borrowed time. One CT scanner was down for maintenance. The other was backed up with a possible stroke, an abdominal emergency, and the usual parade of people whose pain had arrived before their paperwork. Moving Frank in that condition was not harmless either. If Lena was wrong, we would be risking a fragile patient, delaying care for others, and publicly undercutting a resident who had already committed himself to the safer narrative of wait and observe. Reeves pulled me aside and lowered his voice in the way people do when they want to sound reasonable while protecting their pride. He reminded me that the dawn imaging had been stable, that Frank's symptoms could still be explained by swelling, medication, fatigue, or the ordinary chaos of a brain recovering from trauma. Underneath his words, I heard something older than medicine and uglier than uncertainty. The fear of being corrected by someone whose badge carried less authority. Hospitals do not say that part out loud, of course. They hide it under phrases like workflow, chain of command, and clinical judgment. Lena stood near the foot of the bed, not defensive, not theatrical, just steady in a way that left very little room for excuses. She said, "Then let the scan prove me wrong, but do not ask me to ignore what I'm seeing." The sentence landed harder than any alarm in the room. Because it was not about ego anymore. It was about witness. Years ago, I had ignored a nurse's annies over a teenage asthma patient because the numbers still looked decent. And I can still remember the mother's face when decent became dead. Some mistakes leave records, Others move into your bones. Ruth asked me the question families always ask when they can already sense the answer. Is he getting worse? I looked at her, at the soup drying on her hands, at Claire gripping the strap of her purse, like it could hold the world together, and I decided they deserved more than polished uncertainty. I told them yes, I was worried, and yes, I believed we needed to look again immediately. Fear moved across Ruth's face in a slow, devastating wave, but beneath it there was relief too. Because honesty, even painful honesty, gives people something solid to stand on. For one brief moment, the whole IQ seemed to pause around me. If I backed Reeves, I would preserve the order of the room and possibly condemn a man to die according to procedure. If I backed Lena, I would create friction that would outlive the shift. Invite your resentment and risk being wrong in a way everyone would remember. That is the lie institutions teach us. That peace inside the hierarchy matters more than urgency at the bedside. But titles do not hear pupils widening. Titles do not smell the change in a room just before a brain begins to drown in its own blood. So I signed the repeat imaging order myself and called for immediate transport. Reeves looked at me as if I had crossed an invisible line older than either of us. While Lena moved before anyone else had finished objecting, she secured the tubing, tightened the straps, checked Frank's airway, and gave the kind of concise handoff that only comes from experience earned the hard way. I remember thinking, as we rolled him toward the elevator under lights, to bright for mercy, that medicine loves certainty far more than truth. That afternoon, Truth was riding with us on a gurney, wearing compression socks and the fatigue of a 16-hour shift. The ride to radiology felt longer than the whole day that had led to it. The wheels rattled over seams in the floor, the oxygen hissed in short, dry breaths, and Frank's body seemed to sag deeper into the mattress with every turn we took. I stood at the head of the bed watching the rise of his chest, one hand near his jaw, the other wrapped around the rail hard enough to leave marks in my palm. Lena walked beside me with her eyes fixed on his face, not the monitor, because she was past needing a machine to confirm what she already knew. By the time we slid him into the scanner, his right side had gone frighteningly quiet. The room dimmed, the machine began its circular hum, and for a few suspended seconds all we could do was wait for an image to tell us whether instinct had saved us or exposed us. When the first pictures appeared, even before the radiologist spoke, I felt my stomach drop. A dark crescent had spread where there had only been bruising that morning, a fast-growing pocket of blood pressing his brain inward like a fist. Another hour, maybe less, and Frank would have been beyond rescue. The call to neurosurgery turned the corridor into motion all at once. A surgeon in Navy scrubs arrived at a near run, scanned the images, and said we were moving now. Reeves stared at the screen with the emptied expression of a man who had just watched his confidence betray him in public. No one said "I told you so," and certainly not Lena. She was too busy adjusting Frank's oxygen, checking his response, and asking for fresh suction as if vindication were a luxury people only had when alive, was no longer hanging in the balance. Ruth caught my sleeve outside the scanner doors before they took him upstairs. Her fingers were trembling so badly I could feel it through the fabric of my coat. She asked if he was going to die, and there are moments in medicine when every honest answer sounds cruel. I told her he was in real danger, but I also told her something else that needed saying while there was still time. The reason he had a chance was because her husband had been watched by someone who refused to mistake rank for truth. Ruth looked past me to Lena, and the gratitude in that look was almost too raw to witness. Halfway to the operating room, Frank's breathing broke into a ragged pattern I have learned never to trust. His pulse dipped, the monitor cried out, and we had to stop long enough for me to help secure his airway while the team worked around us, in a rush of practiced fear. The hallway smelled like rubber gloves, metal, and that cold institutional air that never changes no matter who lives or dies beneath it. Lena kept one hand on Frank's shoulder until the very last second before the OR doors opened. As if some part of him still needed to be reminded he was not being abandoned. When the doors finally closed and the red light above them clicked on, the silence afterward felt almost violent. Reeves stood beside me with his jaw tight and said, without looking at Lena, that this was exactly how chain of command breaks down. I turned to him more tired than angry and told him chain of command means nothing to a man bleeding under his skull. Then I looked through the narrow window in the door, caught one last glimpse of the surgical team moving under white light, and understood that the hardest part of saving a life is often surviving the pride of everyone who nearly let it go. There is a silence that follows true crisis which has nothing to do with peace. It is the silence of emptied adrenaline, of families staring at doors, of staff pretending to chart while secretly listening for footsteps. We waited outside the operating room for nearly 2 hours under lights that made everyone look older than they were. Ruth sat with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Claire leaned against the wall as if her knees no longer trusted the floor. And I felt the weight of the day settle into my shoulders like wet concrete. When the surgeon finally came out, her mask was hanging loose and there was a deep crease across the bridge of her nose. She told us they had relieved the pressure and evacuated the bleed in time, but time had still taken its price. Frank would live, she said, and those 2 words changed the shape of the hallway. But he would need days before we understood the damage fully, and much longer before we knew the man who came back would resemble the one who had entered. Relief and grief arrived together on Ruth's face, not as opposites, but as roommates who already knew they would have to share the same house. I found Lena an hour later in the break room, sitting on a plastic chair with her lunch unopened beside her and deep red marks across the bridge of her nose from the mask she had worn all day. She looked less like a hero than a person who had simply gone too long without sitting down. That is what the public rarely sees. Lives are often saved by people who still have sore feet, student loans, children waiting at home, and a train to catch after shift change. Glory is almost never the texture of real medicine. More often it looks like exhaustion choosing not to blink. Frank opened his eyes the next morning and recognized Ruth before he recognized the room. His speech was slow and thick, his left hand stronger than his right, and there was a long road ahead of him measured in rehabilitation sessions, missed work, and the quiet humiliations recovery places before proud men. But he was there. He squeezed Ruth's fingers when she cried, and Claire laughed through tears when he tried to ask whether his garage was still a disaster. It was not a miracle in the childish sense. It was something better and harder, a life interrupted, then returned at a cost he could still afford to pay. The gratitude from the family arrived without ceremony and hit harder because of it. Ruth brought Lena a handwritten note folded so many times it looked like it had been prayed over before being delivered. Claire thanked me, then immediately corrected herself and said I had only listened to the right person. She was not wrong. Around us, the hospital kept moving with its usual indifference. But behind closed doors, there were quiet conversations about delayed escalation, about documentation, about how 23 minutes can separate a manageable emergency from a funeral. Reeves never offered Lena the apology she deserved, at least not in any complete form. What he managed was a stiff acknowledgement near the nurse's station. The kind men give when shame has reached them, but pride still insists on keeping half the language for itself. Lena nodded, accepted nothing more than was there, and returned to her patients. She did not seem interested in victory. She had already received the only proof that mattered. Frank was alive. Ruth still had a husband to hold, and a detail small enough to fit inside one human. I had changed the ending of an entire family. I have worked long enough in emergency medicine to know that people imagine our worst memories are the loud ones, the code blues, the broken bones, the blood that reaches your shoes before you have time to step back. They are wrong. The cases that stay with you are usually built from smaller things. A sentence you almost dismissed, a hesitation no monitor could measure. One person in the room who noticed what everyone else was too busy, too proud, or too credentialed to see. Frank Delaney stayed with me for that reason, because his life nearly disappeared inside a detail the size of a pupil. What unsettled me most was how familiar the structure of the danger felt. Not the bleed, not the surgery, not even the rush to act, but the old gravity of hierarchy, pulling everyone toward the easiest story. I had seen that force before, and once, years ago, I had obeyed it. A nurse told me a teenage boy with asthma looked wrong even though his numbers were passable, and I let myself believe the chart because the chart was neat and her concern was not. The boy died before sunrise. There are names I do not say out loud anymore because they still know how to injure me. That is why Lena mattered beyond one good catch on one brutal afternoon. She reminded me that vigilance is not theatrical, and it is almost never glamorous. It is a discipline of attention practiced by people whose names are often left out of family stories after the crisis is over. It is seeing that a joke no longer lands the same way, that a hand comes back to the blanket too slowly, that one eye opens wider than the other under bad fluorescent light. Medicine likes to reward certainty because certainty photographs well. But attention, not certainty, is what keeps the dead from arriving early. A few days later, I passed Lena at the end of another shift. She was walking toward the elevator with her shoulders slumped, her lunch bag in one hand, and a pair of compression socks visible beneath the hem of her scrub pants. No spotlight found her. No administrator gathered the unit for a speech. The hospital had already moved on to new emergencies, new complaints, new families hoping their catastrophe would be treated as the only one in the building. Yet I remember thinking that if I had to choose the person I wanted beside someone I loved in their worst hour, I would choose the tired nurse who still looked twice. Now, when younger doctors work under me and confuse confidence with wisdom, I tell them some version of Frank's story. I tell them that pride has a very polished voice and often speaks in complete sentences, while truth sometimes arrives wearing wrinkled scrubs and asking for one more look. I tell them that authority is useful, but only if it knows how to listen downward as well as speak downward. Most of all, I tell them that a hospital is not saved by rank. It is saved by the people inside it who refuse to stop seeing the patient once the chart has already decided what should happen next. Frank left the hospital weeks later with a slower step, a healing scar, and a future that had been narrowed but not erased. Ruth held his elbow as if supporting him were a privilege rather than a burden, and Claire carried the overnight bag with the reverence people reserve for objects that survived something sacred. I watched them go and understood. Again, the lesson age keeps reteaching me in different disguises. Sometimes a life is not saved by brilliance, but by humility. On that day, it was not the loudest voice in the ICU that saved Frank Delaney. It was the quiet one that refused to look away.